You're a journalist with political analyst. Could you tell us something about yourself? As a journalist, you have been in lots of hotspots and areas of military actions. You've been in Donbass, Syria. What motivates you in your job?
Yes, I'm a journalist. I'm editor-in-chief of non-mainstream German news magazine with the name Zuerst since 6 years. We are maybe one of the biggest non-mainstream news magazines in Germany, and one of our main topics is indeed our geopolitical conflicts, geopolitical hotspots, danger zones, because all these danger zones, all these battlegrounds have a direct influence on our life in Europe. Maybe the most easy example for this is the war in Syria, which results directly into the mass migration problem we have today in Europe. So our magazine was one of the very few which predicted that development already in 2011. And of course, the war in Donbass is also influencing directly the life in Europe when it comes, for example, to the aggressive stance of Brussels, but also of Berlin, London, or Paris against the Russian Federation, which might cause, or which caused already a renewal, a revival of the Cold War times. So all these problems are influencing our lives directly. Unfortunately, the mainstream media is not bringing the truth. They are not bringing the facts. They are media of our governments, to say it like this. And for this, we need, of course, real facts and real information, and this motivates us to go there and to bring the facts directly from these battlegrounds to our audience.
What is your opinion about the wars there in Donbass and in Syria? You have been there, so you can tell us more.
Yes, I just came back from Donbass. I arrived exactly at the day when the assassination of Field Commander Arseny Pavlov, better known under his call sign name Motorola, happened. I participated at his funeral as well. So this reminds us that there is still a war going on. Also, it should remind us, because this war doesn't take place now in the big media in Europe, but there is still a war. It is not just a war against some figures of the Donbass independence movement. It is a war against the civilians, and this war can be only conducted by Ukraine with European help, especially also with German help. That means with German taxpayers' money. And it is, of course, a big mess. It's an abuse of our work, of our German taxpayers, of our German workers, and it's an abuse of course, also of the people in Donbass who suffer under those attacks.
Could you describe your activities in German Center of Eurasian Studies, to whom you are director? Which are the areas of interest in the center, and what is his main activity?
We created the Center for Eurasian Studies in spring this year. It was an idea of me and my close friend Mateusz Piskorski, who is the deputy director of the German Center for Eurasian Studies, by the way, still deputy director, although he is in prison. He is a political prisoner in Poland, but maybe we speak later about that as well. So the German Center for Eurasian Studies is doing, on the one side, of course, research work, especially when it comes to German and European geopolitical interest, which is in 99% of all cases the contrary of what our government and what the EU is right now doing. But it means also not just a think tank, it also is an action tank. That means we participate at electoral observations. We provide services for crisis monitoring, for example. We create political delegations in crisis zones, especially in those crisis zones which are directly concerning our European and also German interests. And we stay in direct touch with local players, and local figures in those areas, in those troubled areas, to support them, to give them our support, and on the other side to get direct and true facts from these regions, to deliver them directly to the people in Germany who are in responsibility.
Are we living in Orwell's book? What is your opinion about freedom of speech in Europe? You know about the arrests in Germany for articles in Facebook against refugee politics and the arrest of Polish politician Mateusz Piskorski.
Yes, Mateusz Piskorski is very clearly a political prisoner. He didn't commit any crime. He sits in prison because of his positive stance towards the Russian Federation. He sits in prison because of his positive approach towards Polish sovereignty, and he sits in prison because of his positive approach towards European sovereignty. Both European and Polish sovereignty, by the way, as well as Bulgarian sovereignty or German sovereignty, are strongly connected to the total de-Americanization, to the total absence of US-American military, US-American intel, US-American cultural hegemony. So he sits in prison because of his strong stance for these positive topics of sovereignty. He didn't commit any crime. And he sits in prison without any trial since May 18, since his 39th birthday, because he was imprisoned at his 39th birthday. He is a victim of the absence of freedom of speech in Europe, because what he did was he spoke out about his thoughts, and that is exactly considered his crime, that he dared to speak very openly about his thoughts, his ideas, and of course because these are very attractive ideas. So the Polish authorities obviously didn't see any other way to counter Mateusz Piskorski than putting him into prison and to silence him by doing that. We have a real problem about freedom of speech in whole Europe, because when our governments are speaking about freedom of speech, they mean in reality you are free to speak anything which applies to the positions of these governments. If you say anything against these governments, you will face a lot of political pressure, you will face political harassment, and you can even face imprisonment, as we see in the case Piskorski. So the ridiculous point about all this is that exactly these governments are traveling around in the world, to Moscow, to Tehran, to Beijing, to Minsk, wherever they can go, and to lecture there these countries and these people about freedom of speech. But of course, it is exactly the wrong the wrong people to lecture others about this, because we have a big crisis when it comes to freedom of speech right here in Europe.
After the Americans' bomb attack against the Syrian army and the increasing tension between USA and Russia, and the insist of West countries for new anti-Russian sanctions because of Aleppo, what do you think? What is going to happen next?
Well, first of all, this attack is no surprise at all, because the real aim of all American activities in Syria is to topple the legal elected government, to topple the legally elected President Bashar al-Assad. All this words about fighting terrorism in Syria is just a smokescreen for the real plan to dismantle Syria, to disintegrate Syria, and to make Syria look like Libya, where no state anymore is existing. So this is no surprise at all. While the Russian Federation and the allies of Syria have geopolitically the total contradictional stance. So they want to have a Syrian national state, a strong Syria, a modern, a successful Syria, and a sovereign and independent Syria. So as long the US are not changing their stance towards Syria, there cannot be any agreement, because it is very unlikely that the Russian Federation would change the stance to the destruction of Syria, because we should never forget what the West, what the US especially wants, is not a sort of reform of Syria, it is the total disintegration and destruction. So Russia, Iran, Syria itself, of course, Hezbollah, and all those powers in support for Syria will not support the destruction of a sovereign state, because they all know very well, if this experiment, this Western experiment, will succeed in Syria, they might be the next on the wish list of the West for total disintegration. So there cannot be an understanding right now. There can be a lot of diplomacy, but at the end, one of both sides will have to admit to be defeated. Right now, it looks very, very good again for Syria. It doesn't look very, very well for the West. But also this pattern can change, as we witnessed within the last 5 years.
And why West starts to look at Aleppo right now? Can the attempt for pushing new anti-Russian sanctions strengthen the dividing processes in Europe, and in what direction?
Well, Aleppo became a very symbolical city, especially also in the Western mainstream media. We have in the social networks a lot of these pictures of burning Aleppo, save Aleppo. But of course, what these mean is right the contrary of what they say. Because Aleppo is not destroyed by the Syrian army, it's not destroyed by the Russian allies, neither by the forces of Hezbollah who are supporting the Syrian army. Aleppo is destroyed by the West and by those who are fighting there on Western payroll, namely by terrorists. And this Aleppo burning campaign is in clear support for these terrorist forces. Aleppo is not just symbolically an important city, it used to be the economic power plant of Syria. It had one of the most modern and successful industrial cities, Sheikh Nachar, which is totally dismantled, by the way, by mercenaries which were paid by Turkey. These mercenaries entered this industrial city, they dismantled factories, they put machines, factories, all production goods and gears on their trucks and brought them to Turkey to sell it there on the black market. Just this as a little example. So Aleppo is playing a very important role, and some people say if the terrorists are defeated once for all in Aleppo, this would have a significant meaning for the terrorist forces fighting on other spaces and other spots in Syria or even in Iraq. This would be a very strong signal for this. So both sides are putting a lot of meaning into this battle. I am personally very careful with such predictions because, of course, if the terrorists in Aleppo are defeated once for all, it might have a significant, it might be a significant change for the moment, but that doesn't mean that the terrorist forces might pop up anytime at any other place in Syria as well. That the West uses now the Battle of Aleppo to make pressure on Russia is also no surprise, because Russia actually is bombarding Western money. This is we have to see it. We have to see it in the most realistic way as it is. The West is investing a lot of money, is paying a lot for the training, for the weaponry of its assets, of the terrorists which are coming from all over the world. And the Russian Federation dares to throw bombs on these people and to destroy them. So to discuss now, to increase the sanctions and the embargoes against the Russian Federation is a direct payback for what the Russian Federation does in Aleppo. So also this is not a miracle, but of course, the West doesn't say that. The West would never say, you are bombarding our terrorists. The West says, you are throwing bombs on little babies and hospitals. But this is the same war lie as they are using since 5 years, and even longer when it comes to the wars, for example, also in Yugoslavia, the war of Kosovo, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. So these are the old lies, the old pattern of justification of Western warfare and Western aggression when it comes to these geopolitical problems.